Welcome to the secret world of Frank Zappa. This is Jazz from Hell.
Hello, Frank Zappa.
The way I see it, Barry, this should be a very dynamite show.
Good evening, I'm Charles Shaw Murray. Welcome to the final program in this series, in which I've marked the 10th anniversary of the death of one of the most extraordinary musicians of the 20th century, by exploring his bizarre relationship with jazz and improvisation. Tonight we turn the spotlight onto Zappa's own playing, charting the development of his unique electric guitar style, presenting some of the highlights of his career as an improvising guitarist, and asking, was he actually any good?
I don't know if he's ever been given due credit for just quite the fine soloist that he was.
We always felt that he just went on too long, as many guitar players do.
Even now, it's hard for me to listen to one of his solos because it meanders so much, you know.
I think he was one of the most amazing guitarists that I've ever seen because of his concept. But at the same time, Frank could play the blues. And I mean play the blues.
And I love the fact that he wasn't afraid to just honk on a note, get a big, overdriven, thick sewer pipe filled of feedback. I always used to think of Frank's guitar like this fuming mass.
Frank Zappa considered himself to be primarily a composer, and, he said, the electric guitar was simply the instrument he happened to play, as opposed to, say, the bugle or the accordion. He considered his improvisational excursions in concert to be attempts at instant composition, during which, briefly freed from the responsibility of choreographing his show and his musicians, he could simply take off and find out where his imagination wants to go. As we've explored in our previous programs, Zappa's musical influences were many and varied: doo-wop, R&B, the avant-garde classics, and ethnic musics from around the world. In the 2 decades plus which separated his 1966 debut album With the Mothers of Invention from his last live performances, his rising confidence as a player allowed him to extend those influences in new and surprising directions. Yet, as a guitarist, he always remained solidly rooted in the blues. His early favourites were radical blues guitarists of the 1950s like Clarence Gatemouth Brown, Guitar Slim, and most prominently, Johnny Guitar Watson, whom Frank particularly admired for his irregular speech-influenced rhythms and his utterly committed tonal attack.
The first time that I heard it, I said, how is he doing that?
Frank Zappa.
Because anytime you heard a guitar in those days on a record, very seldom was it distorted. I think he was probably the only guy who was using a distorted amplifier. And just the whole approach to playing a solo where you just start shredding. You know, he was one of the first guitar shredders.
It took some time for Zappa to develop the confidence to become the soloist we hear on his later records. Perhaps faced with the fact that he wasn't a virtuoso player in any conventional sense, he developed an extremely idiosyncratic style of soloing, based around modes and scales rather than riffs or chord changes, and concentrating on tone and attack. A Zappa composition might have an incredibly complicated melody and rhythm, but when it came to the section that would feature Zappa's own solo, he would alter the arrangement, tempo or harmony to suit his own style, just as Miles Davis did. Keyboard player Tommy Mars.
Frank didn't like to play on changes. He really never did. He wanted 1 or 2 tonalities, and that was fine. Then he could launch from there. Whereas a lot of us like to play on a moving, motoristic kind of set chord changes. It just has a drama to it and a life cycle. Not to say one's better than another. It's just Frank's particular preference, and it always was that. Either it was a kind of blues change, or give me one chord or two chords maximum, and I'm in heaven. And I love the fact that he wasn't afraid to just honk on a note, get a big, overdriven, thick sewer pipe filled of feedback and just blow on one note. And then when you're in an arena and you're moving that massive air, it's like wrestling something from, you know, prehistoric times, some huge reptile. I always used to think of Frank's guitar like this fuming mass.
Frank was an amazing guitarist.
George Duke.
Totally underrated. And I think he was one of the most amazing guitarists that I've ever seen because of his concept, the way he thought about melody and rhythm, the way he constructed his solos. I asked him one day, I said, what in the world are you thinking about when you do your solos? He said, because they sound very angular to me. And he says, well, I think in terms of shapes. And he drew it out for me one day on a piece of paper. He says, okay, there'll be a rectangle here, then a square, then a triangle, and I connect it with a wave or a dot or something. And he says, and a lot of it is very mathematical. But he knows what he's doing. I never really understood it beyond that. He said that's the way he thought. It wasn't in terms of most musicians who think about, I'm going to make this solo, I'm going to start out playing some notes, you kind of just, the spirit kind of takes over and you just kind of blow. I mean, you're not thinking in terms of mathematically compounding this fraction to something else. That's deep. That's deep. But at the same time, Frank could play the blues. And I mean play the blues. When he was on, he could play the blues. And that ain't got nothing to do with mathematics.
Possibly because of traumatic experiences playing in a lounge band as one of his first guitar jobs, Zappa stayed well away from the tones, scales and harmonies usually associated with jazz guitar. Yet he brought to his blues-based playing a range of influences alien to average rock guitarists, or even good ones. Bassist Patrick Ahern.
I think he was influenced by Eastern European music. He loved Bulgarian music and Eastern Slavic music, the odd meters and such. He loved Middle Eastern rhythm and brought that into his compositions as well. He had spent such a great deal of time learning all of the scales, and he really was a master of his instrument. He could get around on the guitar, and he was a fantastic guitarist.
Like many of his guitar contemporaries, Jimi Hendrix and Jeff Beck, Zappa was an eager early adopter of new technology to alter the sound of his guitar. He was using the wah-wah pedal before Hendrix and Beck, or Eric Clapton. Feedback was an essential element of his sonic armoury, and by the early 70s he was having his guitars extensively modified to render feedback more easily attainable and controllable. His guitar sound grew ever more processed or tweaked, and the invention of the locking tremolo in the late 70s gave him access to some entirely new sounds, and he explored them with a vengeance. Here's fellow guitarist and sometime band member Adrian Belew.
Frank had a huge refrigerator-size beast of every effect you could imagine, and I was inspired by that. I watched him get a lot of possible sounds and different things he could do sonically, and I said, that's where I want to go. I find that now I have a great appreciation of what he did. He plays some amazing things on guitar and always has really unique tones, some of which I can't even imagine how he gets.